Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Sania Farooqui show. Today, we have somebody joining us from somewhere in Europe. So, I'm going to quickly introduce her before I let you know where she's from. Shada Islam is one of Brussels' influential and smartest thinkers on Asia, a specialist on European affairs who works independently as a commentator, advisor, analyst, and strategist on Europe, Asia, Africa, geopolitics, trade migration, inclusion, diversity, and women empowerment. She runs her own Brussels-based global strategy and advisory media company, New Horizons Project. Shada, thank you so much for joining us. It's an absolute pleasure to have you on the Sania Farooqui show today.
Sania, thank you for reaching out to me and for having me on your show. It's really nice to meet you.
Lovely, likewise. So, Shada, today we're going to be covering various topics. Everything that's going on in Europe, from the Black Lives Matter, how that changed a big policy in that side of the world, and also how the terror attacks in France and in Austria have put Europe's 25 million Muslims back in the spotlight. So, coming back to what happened in June, the EU adopted the slogan Black Lives Matter. It voted to denounce racism and police brutality, both within the bloc and the US. So, does that mean that Europe is finally ready to talk about racism? Is that happening just on paper, or are we seeing the actions being taken on the ground as well?
Actions are being taken, but before I go into that, let me just say that though my name doesn't show it, am European myself. So this is very important. I know my name is exotic. I was born in South Asia, in Lahore, and I've been here for almost 40 years. I came to Brussels, and I call myself an accidental European because that was not part of my trajectory. But I came here and I've stayed because I love Europe. I love the diversity of Europe and I love the freedom of Europe. So this is something, I'm a proud European to start off with. Now, to come back to your question. So what happened was that in June, when we had these protests in the United States, when George Floyd was tragically killed, there were also riots and protests in Europe. Also Black Lives Matter hashtag, right? And this was quite surprising because we didn't really expect an explosion of emotion and passion in Europe because racism in Europe had been going on, there's systemic racism, there's structural racism, but it's all been sort of par for the course. Agencies have been talking about it, warning that there was a rise and rising, extremist, far-right, populist parties. We knew that there was a really racist agenda being pursued by certain populist parties. But the reaction to that was rather low key, and the question wasn't really top of the agenda of European Union leaders. And what happened was rather interesting. In fact, socially very, very interesting. What happened in the United States and quickly caught the passion of Europeans of color in across the European Union. So not just in the United Kingdom, where there is a very active anti-racist movement, but across the European Union as well. There were riots and protests in France and in Berlin, in Brussels. And people in Europe, people of color in Europe were out in the streets with their white counterparts saying, we also in Europe can't breathe. And this, I think, flustered a lot of European Union leaders because they hadn't expected it. They were coming out and being rather sympathetic to what was happening in the United States, condemning the violence against Black people there. But they were taken aback and rather puzzled by what is happening in our backyard, it's happening in our countries. And that really, I was quite impressed because you had German Chancellor Angela Merkel coming out very early on and saying, look, we have racism in Europe as well. We have issues to deal with as well. Mark Rutte in the Netherlands said the same thing. And very quickly, the European Union, which has actually been very silent about issues of race and ethnicity and religion, actually is very uncomfortable with these questions, also came out, held an emergency meeting and said, look, we have to look into our structural racism, our unconscious biases, and have to start doing something about it. So I was actually, I have to say, having watched this for a long time, written about it for 25 years. I mean, I'm not new to the topic. I was very pleasantly surprised at how quickly people were reacting. Now we do have awareness of the issue. There is an action plan, there's an agenda for action that's been drawn up very quickly by the European Union institutions. And it's been now, what, 3 or 4 months since that was done? And now, of course, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. So in a few weeks, we will be looking back and sort of evaluating
Yeah.
what's been done and what's not been done. So, but at least a recognition has come that we need to act. One thing that I'll say, Sania, before you cut me off, one thing that's very important is that in the European Union institutions per se, there are not many people of color. And that is also a very important part of the anti-racist action plan, is to increase the number of people who look like you and me in the European Union institutions, thereby recognizing us as Europeans, full-fledged Europeans. And that's a big struggle.
Yeah, yeah. Because while all of this was happening, there were still leaders from several European countries who believe, or rather, who still believe, Europe needs to be protected from outsiders. So, who are these outsiders? How do you define that?
So it's a very difficult definition, but it's interesting you should say that, because there is, in fact, an official, a senior official, a European Union commissioner, who has been charged, and the title of his portfolio is Promoting the European Way of Life. So I guess in some people's minds, the outsider is someone who doesn't abide by the European values and the European way of life. Now, you could argue that that's a dog whistle, as many of us have, to the far right, but it's very anchored in the European approach to who is a European, what is European identity, and the hidden message really that comes across is an outsider who is not Christian and who is not white. That is the underlying message that's been given by the far right, by the Marine Le Pens and the Geert Wilders of this world, but also to some extent by mainstream politicians who have bought into the far right discourse because they think it gets them votes. So the message that's coming out is through the school books, through the curricula, through the story of Europe. The story of Europe is an inclusive story, but that story is not being told properly. So the narrative around Europe, who is European, is very much color-based, if you like, and to some extent religion-based. Though, of course, as you know, Muslims are European, Jews are Europeans, Buddhists are Europeans, but that diversity isn't really recognized. And you will still hear a lot of people across Europe when they meet someone like me and I say, well, hello, I'm Belgian, I'm European. And they'll say after a few minutes, but where are you really from? And so, it's not where you're from, that's fine. You can say, well, I'm of Pakistani descent, or I'm an Indian descent, or, I was born in Lisbon and traveled. You can say all that, but it's the really from that really is the very, I would say, how would I put it? Offensive. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So could you talk a little about European government's relationship with its Muslim citizens, considering, we're talking 25 million Muslims, are currently living across Europe?
Yeah, so it's a complex relationship, and it's a relationship that is based on this idea, as I said, that you're really a foreigner here. You're really not part of our history, our culture, our geography, which is total nonsense, because anyone who's done and read history knows that Islam and Muslims are very much part of Europe's history and part of Europe's present. They're huge stakeholders in our economy, in our society, in our politics. But that complexity of what it is to be a European, which brings us to the last bit of conversation we had, the fact that you can have multiple identities, that you can have fluid identities, and that religion is only part of your personality or what identifies you. That is somehow lost in this very simple debate of who is not a European, who is a European, between us and them. And unfortunately, Islam has become very closely tied to the concept of the other. through the centuries, the religious wars, the Crusades, and this idea that somehow Islam is an invader and a foreigner in Europe, I think is an abiding one, which makes it very complex and complicated for European citizens of Muslim descent who live here, 25 million, and growing. And don't forget that in the Balkans, there are countries that are Muslim. And this is, I think overall, if you were to look at the overall figure of Muslims in Europe, it would be more like 50 million or so. So this is, and it's a growing population. So our leaders will have to come to terms with this. So, and I think that process is underway, but it gets pushed back, if you like. There's always a retreat whenever there is a very tragic and horrible terrorist act. And there, the reaction is very much, as we've seen also in the United States after 9/11, there is a tendency, a very unfortunate tendency to try and stigmatize and culpabilize, responsibilize a whole community for the actions of a minority, which is abhorred and absolutely not part of the discourse of the majority of Muslims in Europe, who are taxpayers, law-abiding citizens, and very much, as I said, part of the social fabric, the political and economic landscape of Europe. So it's a complicated relationship. There are advances that are made every day, and then there are retreats and major pushbacks in moments when there are Islamist-inspired terrorist attacks, unfortunately, on our territory.
Yeah. Coming to the migration policy, could you, talk a little about that, considering a lot of refugees, a lot of immigrants who do come into Europe are coming from Muslim countries? How has the policy been reformed? What is being done to not the othering impact of what we just spoke about? How is that being dealt with in Europe right now?
So let me be very sort of clear about this Europe that I love. There are deep divisions in Europe, as there are in many countries, deep polarization between the racist and the xenophobic elements, those who are nativist and who really believe in these crazy conspiracy theories of a replacement being organized by Muslims, etc. The nutcases. And they are really, they are not mainstream. I have to say they're not mainstream at all. This is a very, marginalized communities, but somehow their discourse is, because, this is what happens, Sania, we know that, don't we? That extremists always get the microphone. Extremists always get the limelight, the spotlight, and people who are moderate and people who believe in coexistence and living together, their voices are hardly ever heard, So once again, this extremist minority is getting all the spotlight with its crazy, I always say, loony bin ideas about, what's happening with the Muslim so-called invasion of Europe. But there are sensible people here as well who really believe in living together, who believe that we belong to the same citizenry. We're part of Europe as citizens. And there's this constant struggle between the two, and you can see it, and that's why I'm talking about it, because you can see it in the debate over migration. The European Union is now trying to come up with a new migration pact. 5 years ago, in 2015, there was this enormous rush of refugees and migrants who came to Europe, basically fleeing the Syrian war or leaving, Afghanistan, and they came here. And you remember 5 years ago, the doors of in Germany were opened by Merkel. Angela Merkel took the very brave decision not to close these desperate people out. She brought them in, and they were welcomed. But that created a backlash among the far right and within Europe. So there are populists here. The leader of Hungary is one of them, Viktor Orban, notorious for having said very, very disgusting things about Muslims, really strong insults against Muslims. And he's been told to, I was going to say he's been told to shut up. Yeah, I'll say it. He's been told to shut up by many, many other European politicians. But we are in democracies. He was elected, so we have to bear the consequences of that. But there is a big debate going on migration, and it's symptomatic of what we've been talking throughout, Sania, which is European values and how you actually implement them and enforce them.
Yeah, yeah. Could you talk a little about how the countries are trying to tackle Islamist propaganda, considering we're seeing so many terror attacks take place? Do you think the steps that are being taken are justified? What are the concerns about them?
So first of all, there haven't been that many terrorist attacks taking place, you know. Look, there are extremists in all communities, and there are extremists in living, and extremists, violent extremists exist in many parts of the world. What's happening here is, of course, I mean, that there is. I would say there are elements, radical elements, who have infiltrated into the community. And that is something that I think our security agencies are very aware about and are tracking them after having lived through some rather dramatic and tragic attacks. So I think there's a more vigilance now. And what is also happening and I think this is very important, is that hate speech and recruitment online is being curtailed and is being blocked as well. So a lot of ideas and a lot of action is being taken to counter violent extremism. And that is as much being done vis-a-vis Islamist networks, if you like, some of them very deeply anchored, as it is towards far-right networks as well. So I think it's very important when we talk about Islamist-inspired tragedies, terror attacks, that we also make sure we say that they aren't the only terrorists in Europe or in the world.
Yeah. So what steps can be taken to improve the collaborations across borders, given the current climate, which includes tackling the anti-Muslim sentiments, the migration policy, racism, Islamist propaganda? How do you think Europe can move forward in the current climate, which also includes a pandemic?
Yeah, we are living in a pandemic. Now, I want to say that one of the things that I think we can all do is actually to take a step back and not allow ourselves to be taken away, carried away by emotions. You know, we have to look at race relations, racial justice, migration, Islamophobia or anti-Muslim hatred or anti-Semitism or anti-gay, anti-Roma. I mean, we live in societies where there are elements which are always spreading hate. And I think one of the nasty bits of having had Donald Trump in power in Washington was that there was this real cultural, if you like, cross-Atlantic conversation going on very openly, really, between the far right in the United States and the far right in Europe. And, you know, there were, I mean, it was very, very visible, very, very obvious. There were attempts being made to actually foster anti-democratic forces here in Europe. And so we have to make sure that that kind of conversation is blocked. Whether it's on social media or, you know, we have to educate. And I think this is where democracies or democrats rather than democracies can actually work together on an international level to stop hate speech. Now, this is a big move being taken here in Brussels against online platforms, the Facebooks and the Twitters, etc., of this world, to make sure that there is no hate speech allowed, or when it crops up, it's immediately blocked. So this is extremely important. I also think that we can share experiences and learn from each other on how to respect minorities. I mean, there is, I think, worldwide, I would say people are uncomfortable with the existence of minorities in many, many parts of the world, you know, across the globe. And I think we have to, across the world, we can share experiences on how we can actually improve the treatment of minorities, give them more power, empower them, give them better, and stop discriminating against minorities. For me, this is one of the biggest things that the new president in the United States can bring. He's got a diverse government, a cabinet, etc. Here in Europe, we are moving towards a more diverse political framework as well. And I'm going to be writing something very soon that says that this is the conversation that the United States and Europe need to have, is on race, racial justice, and non-discrimination against minorities. And these things, I think, is where we can actually work with each other. Also, obviously, on issues of counterterrorism as well, where we should be exchanging information more actively. And I think we're beginning to do that. So a lot of room for international cooperation, a lot of room for cross cross-border fertilization of good ideas, not bad ideas.
Yeah. So coming back to what we discussed initially, diversity and inclusion, what is the role women are making or are in the decision-making positions when it comes to everything that you just spoke about?
So this is a very good question, Sania, and thank you for putting it to me, because we're all focused on the wonderful Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand, right? And rightly so, because she's really, let's say, changing perceptions, but her acts are very important. She's a real leader, leads from the heart, but also the head. Here in Europe, we have also some interesting women leaders. I mean, I spoke earlier about Angela Merkel. She's very different from Ardern. Much older also, and also a very different style. But she's also full of empathy. She's also a woman who listens, and she's a woman who understands, and she's a brave woman as well. So I think that is for us, it's very important that there's someone like that in a major country like Germany. She is going to retire next year, so there will be an election, and her contenders, I mean, the new lot who are out for elections are all men, regretfully. So we'll see what happens. But what's really interesting now here in Brussels, I'm in the European, watching the European Union, and we have a Commission president who is a woman, first time ever. The head of the European Central Bank is a woman for the first time ever. So we've got women in very strong leadership positions. To come back, to circle back to what we were talking about, there are some women, actually all of these important files, these important questions that we talked about, racism, migration, Islamophobia, all of these questions are in the hands of women. Yeah. So the value-based discussion that's taking place in Europe at the moment is being led by commissioners who just happen to be women, but they're very, very interesting and powerful women. They're not all from the center right, not all from the center left. They have different political commitments, they have different political ideas, but by some sheer magical coincidence, they are in charge of these major files at the European Commission. I'm rather interested in that. I'm rather, I have to say, proud of that as well. And I'm interested to see how this will evolve in the coming years. But we are in the midst of change here, Sania, in Europe. There's a new awakening, if you like, about issues that had been buried under the rug for years and years, issues to do with religion, race, color. This was considered to be an American problem. It was happening on the other side of the Atlantic. It didn't concern us. Now I think we understand that some of the things we took for granted, colonialism, for instance, a lot of questions are being asked about what really colonialism did to the countries that were colonized. These debates had never been held before. People are talking about school curricula, changing it so children learn about the darker side of colonialism and not just the wonderful things that were done. Statues have been toppled here as well of old colonialists. So we're living through a moment of real change, which I think is very, very, very reassuring and also very good for the future of Europe.
Yeah, so you have an optimistic approach when it comes to tackling all of these factors, including racism, including migration policies, and treatment of Muslim citizens, Jewish citizens, all the citizens who are currently living in Europe.
Thank you, Sania, for asking me that. I don't think I'm optimistic per se, but I think I never give up hope. And I don't think people here have given up hope. As I said, we live in a society which is in the midst of change. Change is always difficult. Transition from one sort of comfort zone, if you like, towards another zone where you're living in multicultural societies, where you're suddenly dealing with people who don't celebrate Christmas. We're used to celebrating Christmas, but then how do we do it with, in a multicultural society? Well, you just go ahead and do it, and invite your Muslim neighbors over, which is happening. So I wouldn't say I'm optimistic or pessimistic. I just think change is happening. Change is difficult, but people have to go for it. And one final thing, what the COVID-19 has shown here is also how important migrants are when it comes to essential services. A lot of our doctors, nurses, tram drivers, truck drivers, supermarket workers, taxi drivers who've been working nonstop during this pandemic are migrants, are Muslim, and sometimes are Black as well. So all of these different configurations that we've talked about have come together, and I think people's perceptions are also changing. Finally, we're an aging society. We need young people. Our age, our number of older people is growing. The number of babies being born is reduced. So we will need foreign labor if we are to survive, as our economies are to survive, if our societies are to survive. So, the far right can bark away. The reality on the ground, is very different, and reality, I think, will actually win, because we need migration, and we live in multicultural, multi-religious, multi-ethnic societies. There's no going back.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, Shada. On that note, we have got our time alert popping up. But thank you so much for joining. This was a wonderful conversation, and good luck with all the work that you're doing. It was truly wonderful to have you here on the Sania Farooqui show. And yeah, thank you again for your time. And for those who have joined us, thank you so much for watching. I hope that you will subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Thank you for watching.